Thank you. Hello, welcome to the Kelly Writers House. Um, I'm really happy we could be here today, that we could be all together. It's been such a hard time. I'm really looking forward to gatherings. I'm looking forward to being together. I'm glad we can do this. And we've been planning it for a while. I'm delighted. I'm delighted to welcome you all here for a reading of Sam Apple's new book, which I think many of you probably saw on the table back there, or you own, or you want to own. It's called Ravenous, Otto Warburg, the Nazis, and the Search for the Cancer Diet Connection. So what we're going to do tonight, I'll introduce Sam briefly. He'll come up and read. There will be time for you to ask questions, so I hope you will have some questions. I have some questions, but this is like a great time to find out about how one writes a book like this. And then we do have some books for sale in the back. If you want to get a book, Sam might sign them. Yes, he'll sign them. And for anybody who wants to stick around for this, we will have food at the end in safe little pre-packaged individual packages for you. But so I want to tell you a little bit about this book. Ravenous, Otto Warburg, the Nazis, and the Search for the Cancer Diet Connection. I think the title tells you something about this book's complexity. It's science reporting. It shares news about a fascinating return to what I think can be called breakthrough cancer research conducted in the early 20th century in Germany by a German Jewish scientist. It's a history book. It considers the Nazis' obsession with cancer. It's a biography about a complicated, petty, arrogant, brilliant scientist. And it's a kind of mystery. How was it that this Jewish gay scientist was able to operate in Germany through the Nazi regime? It's a mystery story. So Sam Apple has managed a true feat to balance all of these elements to create what is like a page turner of a story. For anyone who knows Sam and his writing, I think it'll not be surprising to you that he could pull that off. He's written about one-of-a-kind eccentrics before, like with Schlepping Through the Alps, which is about Austria's only wandering shepherd, who also happens to be a Yiddish folk singer. He's written about parenting, about science, football, family. He writes about serious subjects, but is also one of the funniest writers out there. I recommend everybody go read his short little essay, you might call it, about God in a writing workshop. It's a fun, very funny piece. About this book, I think Philip Lopate may have said it best when he said it like this: Sam Apple is a lively stylist who handles these complex, braided narrative threads with clarity, insight, and a nose for the paradoxical and absurd. The result is a genuine contribution to science writing and a model for how to do contemporary nonfiction. I want to say that we are so lucky that Sam is part of this writing community. This year, he's the winner of our Beltran Family Award for Innovative Teaching and Mentoring, which is a nomination, I should say, that comes from students, and I can't imagine better praise than that. So please help me welcome Sam up here to the podium.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jessica, for that incredibly nice introduction. I couldn't be more happy to be here. I love teaching at Penn and being a part of the Writers House community, and I love that this is my first opportunity to present some of the ideas from Ravenous to a real live audience. I've done a lot of Zoom stuff, but this is a first event, and there's nowhere I'd rather do it, so thank you. I'm very happy to see some students in the audience, including those who I did not force to come for my class. So thank you all for coming out. I know things are crazy now, and it's really nice that you came. I thought that I would do a little bit of talking and then read for around 10 minutes or so, and then talk a little more, and then answer questions if anybody has a question. Question that I sometimes get from people who know me or have known me for a long time is how I ended up writing this book at all. As Jessica mentioned in her introduction, I've written about a lot of different topics, and for many years was not writing about science. So people sometimes say, how did that happen? And it's kind of surprising to me as well, to be honest. I didn't expect to be writing a book about an early 20th century German cancer scientist. I guess nobody really expects to be doing that, but I especially didn't expect to be doing that. It happened sort of gradually. I had written a book on parenting and became very curious about parenting practices, and was really just interested in the question of whether I was going to screw up my son by doing this or that, and so had to read the science to find out. So I became interested in science writing, and I became interested in metabolism and diet as well, in part from reading the works of another science journalist, Gary Taubes, who writes a lot about metabolism, and some other people who were really challenging sort of the conventional thinking about diet and health. It was really just quite surprising to me, because I had grown up thinking the healthiest way to live and eat was to follow a low-fat diet, and grew up only drinking skim milk. And so I started reading some of these articles which critiqued the science behind those dietary recommendations, and was quite surprised, and was sort of interested in the limitations of nutrition science. I was surprised by how difficult it is, which I think everybody agrees upon. Whatever your position may be, it's hard to find the truth when it comes to what's the healthiest diet. So I was interested in that, and then I came across a study which showed that cancer tended to be linked to other metabolic diseases, linked to metabolic diseases like obesity and diabetes. And I was really pretty shocked by that, because I had understood that even cardiovascular disease was related to being overweight and to metabolism, but I always thought cancer was a completely separate realm where people might get an unlucky mutation, or might have an environmental trigger like smoking or sun exposure, which causes mutations, but it didn't seem to have anything to do with metabolism as far as I knew. So I was just intrigued, and just reading really for pleasure. And I came across an article which was talking about some of these ideas, which just mentioned in passing that a German scientist named Otto Warburg had made an important discovery in 1923 about how cancer cells take up nutrients and grow. So I was just curious, and I Googled Otto Warburg, and really, I think within a matter of minutes, I sort of started to see that this, I didn't know that I was going to be writing a book, but like the possibilities awakened very quickly, because he really has an extraordinary story. He was, I'll read a little bit about him, but he was a German cancer scientist who had a Jewish father and was openly gay, or as close to openly gay as one could have been at the time, and yet survived throughout the Nazi period, living in Berlin, and was ultimately protected by the Nazis. So I was just fascinated by his story and by Warburg as an eccentric character, and knew I wanted to write about him. And I think that's where the book really came from. And when I write science stories, I start with science that I'm interested in, but I don't decide to really write about it until I can find a character that really draws me in. I don't feel like I even know how to write a science story if I don't have that character. So I quickly saw that Warburg was a character that I wanted to know more about, and would allow me sort of a frame to write what was originally a magazine article and then became the book. So I became fascinated by Warburg, and I'll just tell you a little bit about his background before I start reading about him. He grew up in the late 19th century. His father was a very well-respected and very important physicist, Emil Warburg, and he had a professorship at the University of Berlin, which was very unusual for somebody of a Jewish background at that time, and he was very close with Einstein and Max Planck and Fritz Haber and Emil Fischer, all the great German scientists of that era. So Warburg grows up in a house really surrounded by among the most important and famous scientists in history, and he is extraordinarily self-confident with respect to his own scientific abilities, and basically decides at a very young age that he's going to grow up and be a great scientist and make a great discovery. It's just sort of assumed, everybody that he knew growing up went on to win Nobel Prizes. A shockingly high percentage of the first Nobel Prizes went to Germans. They were just, dominating science and really making extraordinary progress against infectious diseases and in physics, of course, and really, across the medical and scientific world. They were, so much at the forefront that, all the leading scientific journals were in German, and you had to really know German to be a scientist. So Warburg grows up in this world. He was described as having a religious devotion to science, and he wants to make a great discovery. And the question is, what will that great discovery be? It's only, the question isn't whether he'll make a great discovery, it's what field he'll do it in. And, his idol was really Pasteur and also the German scientist Robert Koch. And he admired these men tremendously and put their portraits up in his library right across from where he sat every day, because they were not only great scientists, but they had changed the world. And just being a great scientist wasn't enough. He had to change the world. So the disease he settles on is cancer. And I think, he never quite said it in this way, but I think the reason he settled on cancer is because it had become a German obsession at the time. In the late 19th century, cancer was growing more and more common in Germany. In the early 19th century, it was quite a rare disease, and it really crept up on the Germans. And year after year and decade after decade, they were not able to make any progress on cancer. And it really started to create a panic in the early 20th century as it grew more common. And so, Warburg wants to be the one that solves the great German, he called it the great problem of his day. And so, sure enough, in 1923, he carries out this experiment, which was a fairly simple experiment, which found that cancer cells were growing. He took them from a rat that had cancer and put them in a dish and studied their metabolism, to study how they were, taking up nutrients and using energy. And what Warburg expected to find, based on his other experiments, is that cancer cells would use a lot of oxygen, because to power our cells, you need to take up oxygen and use that oxygen to burn your nutrients in the mitochondria, which are often known as the power plants of the cell. So you would expect a growing cell would have to do that. You'd have to use a lot of energy, use a lot of oxygen. But the cancer cells were not, in fact, doing that. Instead, they were taking up a lot of glucose, a lot of the sugars that you need for powering a cell. And instead of using oxygen, they were actually breaking it down outside of the mitochondria in a process which is essentially fermentation, the same process that that gives us so many of the foods we love, beer and wine and bread and yogurt and so forth. So Warburg was aware that human cells were capable of this, but it was very surprising that cancer cells were doing this, that they were fermenting and taking up all this glucose and turning it into lactic acid. It was the last thing you would expect that a growing cell would do. So Warburg, was just mesmerized by this and thought that it has to be kind of the key to cancer, this fundamental shift between how a cell eats. And it really was, a huge discovery, which, made a very big, over the years, as other scientists confirmed it, it became very important, was, discussed by scientists around the world, and they tried to understand what it is that causes a cancer cell to eat in this unusual way. And then, he's really at the top of the scientific world now. He's made this huge discovery, and cancer is only one of his areas of expertise. He's also making, world-changing discoveries in photosynthesis, and he wins the Nobel Prize in 1931 for his understanding of cellular respiration and how enzymes function inside our cells. He really kind of figured out the key step in how a cell breathes. So, by the estimate of some experts, he deserved to win the Nobel Prize 3 times. but he only won it once. It actually, again, wasn't for cancer. So this is the place he was in the early 1930s when the Nazis come to power. He has a brand new institute, which was built by the Rockefeller Foundation, gave him the money for it. And he's, absolutely at the top of the world of science. And then, suddenly the Nazis come to power and, basically give him the message that he is not welcome in Nazi Germany. And he had also been a veteran of World War I. And like many Jewish scientists or scientists of Jewish heritage, it was stunning. Warburg and many of these others didn't really even think of themselves as Jewish. They just happened to have Jewish parents. So, Warburg was astonished by this. And I'm now going to read for a little bit about a moment that comes from the beginning of my book and takes place in 1934, where you'll get a sense from this little section about how Warburg responded to the Nazi takeover of Germany. On January 16, 1934, a Nazi customs official arrived at the door of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Cell Physiology with a stack of papers. A recently issued Nazi decree required scientific institutes to obtain a special license for the purchase of ethanol. The Institute for Cell Physiology had sent in its application 6 days earlier, but had failed to return all of the necessary documents. Noticeably missing was a declaration of Aryan descent from its director, Otto Warburg. The Nazi official had brought along a blank form so that this oversight could be corrected. Like most of the other scientific institutes of the Kaiser Wilhelm Society, the Institute for Cell Physiology was located in Dahlem, a quiet neighborhood of elegant villas in the southwest corner of Berlin. Though connected to the city by train, Dahlem, sometimes called the Oxford of Germany, was a small world unto itself, home to a significant portion of the greatest scientists alive. In the years before the Nazis came to power, it would have been hard to walk from one end of Dahlem to the other without bumping into a Nobel laureate. Otto Warburg himself had won the Nobel Prize only 3 years earlier. He was considered by many to be the greatest biochemist of his generation. Standing on the doorstep of Warburg's Institute, the Nazi customs official, Mr. Tesch, was likely wearing the uniform of his office, with the green swastika-adorned sash visible on the sleeve of his long wool coat. As Tesch would have known, it was no accident that the Declaration of Aryan Descent was missing from Warburg's application for an ethanol license. Warburg may have been the most famous Jewish name in all of Germany. Though best known as the family behind the legendary Hamburg-based M.M. Warburg & Co. Bank, the Warburg influence extended beyond finance. Members of the family were leading scholars, artists, and philanthropists, a veritable German Jewish aristocracy in a country that, long before Hitler, had severely restricted the place of Jews in public life. Otto Warburg's mother was not Jewish, but it only took one Jewish grandparent to make him a non-Aryan, according to the Nazi regulations of 1933. Warburg had 2 Jewish grandparents, and his famous Warburg cousins in finance were frequent targets of Nazi propaganda, the very symbols of Jewish capitalist greed. Given that Warburg also lived with a male servant rumored to be his homosexual partner, he had as much reason to fear the Nazis as almost anyone in Germany. The door to the institute was opened by an employee, probably one of Warburg's research assistants, who told the Nazi official that Warburg was unavailable. Tesch left the blank Aryan descent form with the employee, making it clear that he needed it returned within 48 hours. 3 days later, still awaiting the filled-out form, Tesch called the institute. A secretary answered and passed the handset to Warburg. "I served in the military and was an officer," Warburg blared into the phone. "It is out of the question that I will sign this form." Though Tesch already knew that Otto Warburg was not of Aryan descent, there was something else about Warburg that he likely did not know when he placed that call. Whether Warburg was the greatest biochemist of the era was debatable, but he was almost certainly the most self-important biochemist who ever lived. As a colleague put it, measuring arrogance on a scale from 1 to 10, Warburg rated 20. Warburg was so enamored with himself that he once refused to be photographed with a group of scientists he deemed beneath him, and a number of these scientists in the group were Nobel Prize winners. For someone entirely convinced of his own greatness, the idea of a Nazi lowlife telling him which chemicals he could and could not order was almost unthinkable. As Warburg once put it to his sister, "Ich war vor Hitler da," I was here before Hitler. Still fuming days after the phone call, Warburg ordered a secretary to call the customs office that had sent Tesh to his institute. "Professor Warburg does not wish to see the customs official who delivered the forms again," the secretary announced, and if necessary would have him removed from the building. The Nazi official on the other end of the line was stunned, but Warburg's secretary wasn't finished. Asked to explain why Warburg was behaving so rudely to a government official, the secretary responded that Tesh had arrived at the institute unshaven and had spread, quote, unpleasant odors around him. The odors, he clarified, had presumably originated from an unclean body. The Institute for Self-Physiology, the secretary explained, had to ensure a meticulous level of cleanliness. To the hygiene-obsessed Nazis, few insults could have been more offensive. While the archival documents suggest the secretary was a she, it was likely Warburg's male partner, Jakob Heiss, who told off the customs official. Heiss, who would later become the administrator of the institute, was rarely far from Warburg's side, and he was in the habit of shouting people down on his behalf. A glassblower who worked at the institute after the Second World War remembered Heiss screaming at unwanted visitors in exactly the manner of the secretary on the phone with the Nazis. Warburg's message did not get through to the customs office. Tesh reappeared at his institute that same day, demanding the completed Aryan descent form. An employee led him to a laboratory room with an open door. Standing before the entrance to the room, the Nazi official came face to face with several researchers, including Warburg. Warburg was a handsome and compact man. He kept his hair short, neatly parted to one side, and swept back over an always clean-shaven face. On the day that Tesh returned to the institute, Warburg may have been wearing a white lab coat over one of the cardigans or tailored English sports coats he favored. Few things annoyed Warburg more than interruptions of his work. To avoid unwanted visitors, he installed a brass plaque by the door of the institute, indicating that the visiting hours began at 6:30 p.m. In photos, Warburg's heavily lidded blue eyes have a dreamy quality, leaving the impression of a man lost in deep thought. But if Tesh directed his gaze to Warburg at this moment, he almost certainly would have been met with eyes that could fill with, quote, spark-shooting rage, as one biochemist recalled. Sorry, I'm going to take a sweat break. It's very hot out here for my YouTube watchers. Okay. Tesh had never met Warburg and did not recognize him as he stood before the laboratory door. As Warburg approached, Tesh raised his right arm to the ceiling and stiffened it at 45 degrees in a rigid Nazi salute. Warburg was expected to salute back. Instead, he walked past Tesh into the hallway without speaking. Tesh was flabbergasted. It was, quote, an outrageous disregard of a civil servant who is a representative of the National Socialist state, he wrote in a report on the incident. With Warburg now standing behind him in the hallway, Tesh demanded his name. According to Tesh's testimony, Warburg turned halfway around, announced who he was, and pointed down the hall. "There is the door," Warburg said. "Leave the building." Warburg would have to repeat the demand several more times before Tesh finally departed. Warburg immediately filed a formal complaint with the customs office, stating that the institute no longer had possession of the form Tesh wanted and that it no longer needed any ethanol. For all his bravado, Warburg was likely nervous. After sending off his complaint, a secretary, presumably Heiss, called the customs office and asked what would happen if Warburg were never to provide evidence of his Aryan descent. The matter, the secretary was told, would have to be addressed with the Kaiser Wilhelm Society, the parent organization of Warburg's institute. At this point, according to the report of the customs office, Warburg's secretary announced in a tone of derision that Warburg's institute was privately funded and did not need to follow instructions from the Kaiser Wilhelm Society. The Nazi customs officials had heard enough. The office sent a report of the incidents to Max Planck, the president of the Kaiser Wilhelm Society and the effective head of German science. In it, Tesh said that Warburg had, quote, grossly insulted him and demonstrated a disregard of the German salute that was, in his opinion, characteristic of Professor Warburg's attitude toward the current state. Unless Warburg apologized, the report stated, further steps could be taken against him. Planck recognized the seriousness of the threat. On February 13th, 1934, he sent Warburg a telegram. Honored Professor, the President asks you to appear for a consultation on Friday the 16th of this month, 12 o'clock at noon, here at the Palace, and then signed Heil Hitler. While there is no record of what was said at that meeting, Planck let the customs office know that he had spoken to Warburg about his behavior and that future requests for ethanol would come from the administration of the Kaiser Wilhelm Society rather than directly from Warburg's institute. Warburg, having seemingly avoided even the slightest consequence for his actions, might have left the matter there. Instead, 5 days later, he sent a note to Planck stating that the new Nazi restrictions made for impossible working conditions. Something needed to be done, and Warburg had a suggestion. He wanted Planck to contact the Reich Ministry of Finance with instructions on how to adjust the existing racial decrees. Warburg even offered specific language for the revised legislation so that it would be clear to all that non-Aryan institute directors were, quote, to be treated like Aryan directors. In 1934, at a moment when Hitler had already begun sending Germans to concentration camps, Otto Warburg, a gay man of Jewish descent, wanted Nazi laws rewritten according to his personal needs. Okay, I will stop reading there. Thanks. Sorry for all the sweat. Okay, so that is Warburg. I hope that captures a little bit of who he was and how he responded to the Nazis. And that was 1934, but that was really only one of many incidents that he had. At one point, some of these brown shirts came to his institute and demanded that his employees attend the Nazi march, and Warburg, screamed at them, said he would burn down his institute before he would allow it, and chase them away, and just time after time this went on, and it's really extraordinary that he got away with it. But in the meantime, all of his colleagues that had Jewish parents or grandparents were fleeing Germany, and he remained. And I do think that it's difficult to understand from our current perspective why he would remain. But one thing that became clear to me as I was doing my research is that while it seems like the most morally respectable thing one could do is leave Nazi Germany, at the time it was actually a source of great shame for these Jewish scientists. It was accepting their second-class status as Germans to pick up and leave in the early 1930s. And once I understood that, I immediately understood that Warburg could never have left because it was impossible for him to, accept humiliation in any form. So he stayed, and like a lot of people, he also thought that the Nazis would be a short-lived phenomenon. And his cousin said, they just need enough rope to hang themselves. So he waited, and then eventually it was too late. Eventually he became, something of a pawn for the Nazi regime. They could say, we've still got this guy here who has Jewish heritage, and his situation became more and more precarious. He was of these Kaiser Wilhelm institutes. He became the very last person left who had Jewish heritage. And it really finally came to a head in 1941. At that point, he has a lot of enemies, mostly because they're Nazis, but some people who probably hated him even before the Nazis came to power because he had so many scientific enemies. They get him evicted from his institute, and the war has already started by now. So for a while, there were some political benefits to keeping him alive, but those are all gone now after the war starts. And the Nazis no longer care that he gets money from the Rockefeller Foundation. So Warburg is in a bad situation, and he's called into Nazi headquarters to this new chancellery that Hitler has built, and he's asked to meet with a top Nazi official, an SS man named Victor Brack, who is among the worst of the worst Nazis. He's one who actually sort of orchestrated the Nazis' first killing operation, which many people don't know, but actually was not an operation designed to kill Jews, first and foremost, but the disabled. So this is who Warburg meets with on June 21st, 1941, and that same day, Victor Brack has a meeting with Himmler about Warburg. And Warburg comes in, and there's these long marble hallways that he has to walk down, and this incredible building. And they sit him down and tell him that they're going to keep him alive under one condition, that he agrees to focus entirely on cancer. It's a pretty extraordinary thing, and it's hard to understand, and I don't know if I have enough time to go into it here, but a big part of this book is trying to understand why the Nazis were so obsessed with cancer, and Hitler had a personal connection to cancer. His mother had died of breast cancer, but it went well beyond that. It really permeated Nazi thinking and was an obsession of many of the leading Nazis. So Warburg is allowed to live, and when I started my research, I learned about this event, but had not realized the significance of the day. This was June 21st, 1941. Turned out to be the day before, really only hours before, the launch of Operation Barbarossa, which is the most really significant moment of the entire Nazi project. It's when they launched this, extraordinary and, extraordinarily insane invasion of the Soviet Union and gamble everything. And just the fact that only hours before they were dealing with Warburg, is very strange, and just a reflection of how focused they were on cancer. And in fact, later that night, we have a diary from Goebbels recorded that he and Hitler, just literally a couple hours before the invasion of the Soviet Union, were talking about cancer research. I didn't find direct evidence that they were talking about Warburg, but cancer was right up on their minds, right up in these last minutes before this huge invasion, which was the biggest military operation in history at the time. So that's the background, and I'm going to speed through the rest of Warburg's story, but after the war, he eventually sort of regains some prominence. He's allowed to get his institute back, and he does more research on this unusual way that cancer cells eat, this fermenting of the cancer cells, and begins to make more and more outrageous statements saying that this is the true cause of cancer and there can be no other explanation, and anybody who disagrees with them, he dismisses. He once appeared before a conference of Nobel laureates and showed them this graph about cancer cells fermenting and said everything else about cancer science is garbage. So he was making more and more enemies, of course. But at the same time, it wasn't just Warburg's behavior that caused people to grow skeptical of this cancer metabolism, this theory about cancer being a disease of eating. There was another problem, which is that there were always competing ideas about what caused cancer. In the postwar period, many people thought that cancer was caused by viruses, and then in the 1970s, they had the discovery of oncogenes, genes that are normal human genes that become mutated and that cause cancer in this mutated form. And this really became the sort of prevailing view, and remains to this day the way we understand cancer, is that you get a mutation, and this is the real story of cancer. So Warburg's ideas weren't necessarily in contradiction with some of the new, genetic thinking on cancer, but they seemed unimportant. The enzymes that Warburg studied that he wrote about were referred to as housekeeping enzymes. And the idea was that the real story of cancer was in the DNA and these mutations. And sure, a cancer cell needs energy, but that just comes whenever it needs it. It has nothing to do with the rapid division of cells that characterize cancer. It's like if you were like an old world person who studied biochemistry, maybe you're interested, but it was not the cool stuff, as one cancer scientist put it to me. So it completely gets lost. I mean, it's just amazing to me the extent to which Warburg's research was lost. It disappears from textbooks. There's a famous paper in 2000 that comes out called The Hallmarks of Cancer, which lists like the 6 fundamental aspects of what cancer is. It doesn't even mention metabolism, even though it's this fundamental shift that 70% of more cancers do this. They take up more glucose and ferment it. And what's really striking about it, I think, is that even as everybody was forgetting about Warburg, they introduced this new test called the PET scan, which diagnoses cancer just by looking at where in your body, more glucose is being taken up, and that's where you have cancer. So it's so fundamental, and yet it was completely lost, absent from textbooks, absent from The Emperor of All Maladies, an amazing book about cancer, but just to give you a sense of how much this disappeared. Warburg isn't even mentioned. And then, as all this was going on in the late 90s, these cancer scientists who were studying oncogenes were sort of, tracing a pathway through the cell, like one protein signals another protein, and not being at all concerned about metabolism until these pathways they found sort of making their way back to the metabolic enzymes that Warburg had studied, and it was really shocking to them because they thought this had nothing to do with cancer. And the synthesis that has occurred in the last couple of decades is understanding that these oncogenes that cause cancer actually do so first and foremost, I think, and many scientists think, by changing metabolism, by changing the way a cell eats. And a lot of that work actually took place at the University of Pennsylvania in the laboratory of Craig Thompson, who's now the CEO of Sloan Kettering. So it's really exciting for me to be talking about that here as well. And, really changed the way we think about cancer because, as Craig Thompson explains it, that it's true that a cancer cell needs to be able to gain the ability to divide and divide and divide. But if you gain the ability to divide whenever you want to, and you don't have the ability to eat whenever you want to, it's not going to be a very successful construction project. It's, as Thompson put it, it's a catastrophe for the cell. So it really had to be that the origins of cancer, in a sense, were this ability to gain nutrients. And, Thompson talks about it as what a body really is a social agreement among cells to eat only when you're told to eat by other cells and by these growth factors. And what cancer really is a breakdown of that agreement, like I'm going to eat whenever I want. And once you can eat whenever you want, then it awakens new possibilities for the cell. Then they're no longer playing by the body's rules. As one cancer scientist put it to me, it's a return to the wild. And so that's a big part of my book. And then the final part of it is about diet and how we eat. Because, even if this had nothing to do with diet, I think, it's a pretty interesting story about changing our understanding of what happens inside of a cancer cell. But, if the story is that cancer cells have this metabolic change that, is fundamental to the origins of cancer, then the sort of inevitable question that arises is, okay, so if cancer cells are overeating, does that have something to do with how we eat or something to do with our diets? And in the last part of the book, I argue that it does. And one of the interesting things that I discovered is that at the same time that these scientists were rediscovering Otto Warburg and working in their laboratories on the metabolism of the cancer cell, another group of scientists, epidemiologists, were discovering that cancer was strongly linked to obesity, and that these two things happened at almost the exact same time. I thought it was very revealing. And in the last part of the book, I try to talk about what it is that connects obesity and cancer. And I argue actually that thinking about cancer as a problem of obesity, and I don't mean all cancers, but I mean many cancers. There's been 13 different types of cancer that are now linked to obesity, and others that probably will be soon. But my argument at the end of the book is that it's not so much that obesity is the driver of cancer so much as that the certain diets lead to a metabolic shift which raises levels of a hormone, insulin, which is actually driving many types of cancer and obesity. So Warburg didn't know any of that. He was sure that the shift to fermenting was the key to cancer, but he didn't know, he died too soon for a lot of these discoveries. And, as I say in the book, that, I think he would be pleased that this book is in some ways a redemption story about how his work was rediscovered, but I also think he would have found 1,000 things to hate. So I will stop there and take questions if anybody has one. Thank you.
I have a question, but I would love to start out. Oh, yeah.
Hi, I've just been like amazed reading the book, and something I've been kind of wondering is like when you're working on a book like this, that's just like so huge, in every way, how do you kind of sustain yourself? Like, how do you keep going with something that takes so much time and attention and research?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and it helped a lot that I initially wrote a magazine article, and the publisher saw the magazine article and said, "Do you want to turn this into a book?" And I hesitated briefly because I wasn't sure that I had the stamina to do it. But it was a great publisher, and I couldn't turn it down. And I knew there was much more to say. But if I hadn't had that deadline, in the agreement on the first stage, then it would have been really challenging to write the entire book, as some people do. And certainly in fiction writing, it's common that people write the entire book. In nonfiction, you often have a contract first, and so once you have that deadline, then that helps tremendously, because they gave me money and I had already spent it, so I pretty much had to finish.
On like a similar note, what did research look like for this? Like, was it surfing through like archives or more interview, or can you break that down for us?
Yeah. Yeah, it was really both. I had experience as a journalist doing interviews, but I had never really done archival research, and really didn't know what I was getting into. And I discovered that Warburg's letters are scattered all over the world. I couldn't believe that. I just assumed at the beginning that they'd all be in one place, but that's not how it works, unfortunately. And so, most of it was done. I went to Germany and looked through some archives there, but almost all of it was done just by looking online, finding different places that had his letters and documents, and then asking these archivists to scan them and send them to me. And I was just amazed by how generous people were. I mean, in some cases you have to pay, but even so, like I made the dedication in this book to everybody who helped, because it's really like hundreds of people were involved. And I have to give a shout out also to Dylan Bergen, who was a Penn student who became my apprentice, and was just an enormous help throughout the entire process. And I don't know if I could have done it without him. I don't have my glasses on. Is that Dylan back there? Oh my God, Dylan! Hi. I saw somebody waving. See, so nice that you're here. That shout out, I didn't even know you were here when I was shouting you out. Wow. All right, we will catch up soon. But yeah, no, Dylan is my hero, because it would have been very, very hard for me without the support at a critical stage in the process.
Hi. So what first drew you to Warburg's story? Like, how did you first stumble upon it, and what made you want to write a magazine article about him?
Yeah, good question. It was, partially just the story of survival in Nazi Germany, and how shocked I was that, somebody of his background made it through and was protected by the Nazis. But even more than that, I'm really drawn to eccentrics. In my other projects, I always have sort of an outlandish character to write about. And, it's almost too, problematic, because a lot of the stuff that Warburg did that, that people found outrageous, his behavior, like, I find it amusing. And I have to remind myself that it's actually, appalling the way he sometimes, treated other people. And of course, I mean, I see that it's appalling, but I'm just, amused by some of his outrageous antics. But there were times, I should say, that, I was less amused as I did more research. And, he really did some despicable things that made it hard to like him in the same way. I don't think an author has to, like their protagonist, but you want to be able to at least put yourself in their shoes and to see the world from their perspective. And there were times where it was hard to do that, particularly at the very end of the war, where he felt betrayed by the researchers in his lab. Rightly so, they had sort of turned him into the Nazis, but then Warburg, in turn, could have given them a document excusing them from being on the front lines at the end of the war when it was really just, Hitler was just having all the Germans commit suicide at that point, basically. And Warburg, didn't help his lab workers avoid that fate. So they did survive, but he really left them to possibly die. So it was really pretty appalling. But in the end, I kind of had to forgive him as a writer, and I was able to do so in part because after the war, a number of Jewish scientists continued to really love him and admire him, and I thought, well, if those guys can forgive him for everything, then I can too. But it was and remains a challenge to think about him and his behavior.
I know you mentioned that you've written like a lot of like nonfiction in the past, but what in particular about like science writing like do you like above like other like genres?
Yeah, I think that I think it's it's easier in a lot of ways because when I'm not writing about science, I always have to sort of figure out where the story is, and science comes ready-made with the stories usually. I know the significance. I wouldn't be writing about it if the science wasn't interesting, and there's a built-in story in science in terms of you have a scientist who has a question, and the experiments, whatever research they do, is sort of a quest to get an answer, and then you get the answer. So there's this storytelling which comes naturally, but you still, at least for me, I still need the right character to tell that story. But I love telling scientific stories, and also what's a pleasure to me is that as much as I love doing non-science journalism as well, that I hope that some of the science here will actually have an influence on people's lives and health. So that's a nice bonus, assuming I'm not leading everybody down the wrong path.
I'm curious about the sourcing for the scene you read for us, and
Yeah.
Did it come mostly from one Nazi document of their interactions with him,
Yeah.
or not? And how did you even know to look for it? And when in your research did you find it? Is it something you found very early or late, or?
Yeah, that I got sort of lucky with that scene. It almost all comes from a paper done by another Warburg scholar, a real scholar in Germany who discovered the documents which recount this episode and then wrote a paper about it. So I actually didn't have any of that when I started working on the book, and then I had been in touch with this scholar all along, and she wrote this paper while I was writing the book, and it was like a godsend because it's so hard to recreate full scenes and episodes like that, and I don't have too many scenes like that. So once I had that, I quickly saw that not only was it a scene I could work with, but I was going to put it at the start of the book because there aren't that many moments that I can recreate in that way.
Cool.
I'm not really keeping track of time, so just let me know if whenever you. I'm happy to keep taking questions or. All right. Yeah. I'm up for it.
My question. Hi, I'm going to ask a question.
Yeah.
So my question is related to science writing. I saw a YouTube video recently where a scientist explained the same concept at several different layers. So to a first grader, to a high school student, graduate, undergraduate, graduate student, and a professional in the field. How do you go about ensuring, because in the book, there are high-level molecular and biological concepts, but they're narrative. They're approachable for people that aren't biologists or molecular chemists. Where do you find the right level of conceptual description, and how do you test? Do you test that, or how?
Yeah, good question. It is something I thought about throughout the writing of the book and struggled with, and still look back at passages and wonder if I got the balance right. But it's very hard because I do feel in a way like I was writing for two audiences. First and foremost, it's a popular book, and I was writing for the public and wanting to convey science that's pretty complicated and make it understandable. But I was aware throughout that it would be read by scientists, including the scientists I write about, and I wanted to present the science in a way that they would feel was an accurate reflection and a truthful account of their work. So I really struggled with it, and there may be a few lines in there that maybe were too complicated for a general audience, but I accept at the beginning when you're writing for a popular audience that there's a lot of simplifying. It's inevitable, and you're never going to capture all the science. And I hope that the scientists who read it understand that and appreciate that you have to strike that balance. It's very hard to find the sweet spot between the two. But that's always a problem in science writing, and I do think you just have to accept that there's going to be a lot of oversimplifying, and that in the end, if you make it too complex, you're not doing yourself or anybody else any favors. I was going to say something else, but I don't remember. But it's a good question because I thought about that a lot.
Did you think about a queer audience while you're writing it? It's kind of like in the book, Warburg's identity as a queer person is like secondhand, and because of all of the contradictions in the Nazi regime. It's like just contradictions from the top down. How did you, as you were writing, think about Warburg as like a queer man, but also as a scientist and also as somebody like problematic?
Yeah, it's a good question. I was just going to add to your previous question that I've joked before that I have an advantage over the scientists who try to write about this stuff, is that I don't really understand it. I mean, I'm joking, but it is an advantage as a storyteller to not be in the lab, to not know every last nuance, because it's so hard when you're so deep in the weeds of the molecular biology to step back. So being an outsider in some ways is an advantage. But to your second question, I do think that the fact that Warburg was gay and is fairly openly gay was a really important part of the story, and it's not one that I really devoted a lot of time to in the book. I think that's a fair criticism if somebody wants to read more about that, but for me it was just I was just already taking on more than I could handle between everything else, and something sort of had to give. But I could have and probably should have written more about that aspect of his life, because it's certainly an important part of his story. And when I looked for things that made Warburg a redeeming character, the ones that I admired most about him was actually his open, or fairly open, homosexual relationship with Jakob Heiss, because there was real risk to it, and he would, he'd be invited to speak somewhere and say, "I'm not coming unless Heiss comes with me." I mean, that was incredibly bold, and it was really an incredibly loving relationship. So it's an important part of the story, but I didn't really provide much of the context for what it was like to be gay at that time. And it's a good point. I certainly think it belongs as part of the story.
Hello, thank you for coming and speaking to us today. We have a question from someone in the YouTube chat. Lise Funderburg asked, did you travel for this book's research? If so, how did you decide where to go and why?
Thank you, Lise. I traveled primarily only to Berlin and to Dahlem. That's where Warburg's Institute is still standing, and in Dahlem, this neighborhood in Berlin, and it's now the archives of the Kaiser Wilhelm Society. So I traveled there and got to walk around and sort of get a feel for where he lived. And another thing I enjoyed seeing is that he's buried very nearby his institute, and he and Heiss are buried side by side, which I don't think was commonly done at that time. So that was nice to see. And I got to meet Warburg's glassblower, who made all the vessels that he worked with, was still alive and told me some great stories. So even more than the documents, or as much as the documents, just having that experience to sort of be in his world a little bit and get a little bit of a feel for it to the extent that I could was really important. But most of the other research was really done online and getting documents from these other institutes. All right, well, thank you all very much for coming. I really appreciate it.